14-year-old black girl points at judge. You're the killer. Judge left speechless. The courtroom was suffocating, thick with tension on the verge of eruption. Every seat was filled, lawyers rigid, reporters poised, officers watching for the slightest disturbance. The jury sat still, eyes shifting between the defendant's table and Judge Victor Calloway. Seated in his high-backed chair, Calloway was a figure of absolute authority, his gavel within reach. His verdicts were law, his presence unshakable. Today should have been no different. And then, the world cracked open. You are the killer! The words didn't just cut through the silence, they tore it apart. Every head snapped toward the voice. Eyes widened, jaws slackened in disbelief. At the very center of the room, Helena Carter stood, her small frame rigid with fury, her arm outstretched, finger pointing directly at the most powerful man in the courtroom. Her voice was not the tremulous cry of a frightened child. It was steel, sharp, and unwavering. For a moment, the entire courtroom was frozen in collective paralysis. Then chaos erupted. Gasps rippled across the chamber. Reporters scrambled to aim their cameras. The stenographer, who had been transcribing every word, sat frozen, her fingers hovering uselessly over the keys. The murmurs turned into frantic whispers, disbelief and confusion spreading like wildfire. At the judge's bench, Victor Calloway did not move, but his fingers curled around the gavel, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. His carefully maintained mask of composure held firm, but something flickered in his eyes. Anger, shock, and beneath it all, for the briefest of moments, fear. Helena saw it, and she knew. Her breath came hard and fast, her chest rising and falling with barely contained emotion, but she did not falter. She took a step forward, her heart hammering against her ribs, her hands trembling, but her voice strong. I know what you did, she said, her words ringing through the courtroom like the crack of a whip. A judge was supposed to be untouchable. His word was law, his presence unshakable. And yet here he was, sitting in absolute silence, trapped beneath the weight of a 14-year-old girl's accusation. Helena's voice was steady, but inside she was burning. For months she had been dismissed, labeled delusional, brushed aside as a child who didn't understand the world. She had begged for someone, anyone to listen, to see the truth, but no one had cared. They had called her father a traitor, a deserter, a coward who abandoned his family and his duty. But she knew better. She knew the truth had been buried, just like the man who had tried to uncover it. And Victor Calloway had been the one to bury it. The whispers in the courtroom turned into a roar. Lawyers turned to one another in hushed conversation. The jury exchanged startled glances. Calloway finally moved. He leaned forward, his voice booming like thunder. Order in the court! The bailiff snapped to attention, moving toward Helena, but she did not flinch. She knew what would happen next. They would silence her. They would remove her from the courtroom. They would make sure her words were forgotten. But not this time. She had made them listen. It started long before today, before the accusations, before the betrayal, before the world turned its back on her family, before her father vanished. Helena Carter had never doubted that her father was a good man. To her, Detective Ethan Carter was more than just a cop. He was a warrior against corruption, a man who refused to compromise his principles no matter the cost. He didn't wear his badge as a symbol of power, but as a responsibility, a promise to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He wasn't the kind of father who just existed in the background. He was present. He was the one who taught her how to ride a bike, how to stand up for herself when kids at school picked on her, how to never back down from what was right even when it was hard. He taught her how to question things, how to look past the surface and search for the truth. Justice isn't about who holds the most power, Helena, he would say. It's about who's willing to fight for what's right, even when no one else will. She believed him. She lived by his words. And she thought, no, she knew, that as long as he was there, nothing could ever touch them. She was wrong. It started like any other night. He had kissed her goodnight, ruffled her hair, and told her he'd see her in the morning. But morning came, and he didn't. The first few hours were filled with confusion. Maybe he had been held up at work. Maybe there was a case that had required his attention, but as the hours stretched into a full day, then another, the uncertainty turned into something heavier, something darker. Then came the call. The department claimed he had abandoned his post, walked away. No sign of struggle, no distress call, no explanation. He had simply vanished. Helena didn't believe it, not for a second. But it didn't matter what she believed. The media seized the story like vultures descending on a carcass. Decorated detective disappears, corruption scandal unfolds. Ethan Carter, a hero or a traitor? They painted him as a coward, a disgraced officer who ran when things got too messy. Someone who had seen something he shouldn't have and chosen to save himself instead of standing his ground. The police didn't look for him. They didn't even pretend to. As far as they were concerned, his story was closed. His name was already being erased from their records, his commendation stripped, his years of service reduced to nothing. And just like that, the world turned its back on the Carter family. The people he had protected, the ones he had risked his life for, wanted nothing to do with them now. It started with whispers. At the grocery store, at school, even walking down the street. People stared. They averted their eyes, but not before she caught the judgment in them, the silent condemnation. Then came the avoidance. Her teachers no longer called on her in class. Friends who had once spent every weekend at her house suddenly stopped answering her messages. Then, the outright hostility. One night, someone spray-painted "coward" in thick red letters across their front door. She still remembered standing there, staring at it, her fingers clenched into fists so tight her nails cut into her palms. Her father wasn't a coward, but trying to convince the world of that was like screaming into a void. She had gone to the police, demanding they reopen the case, pleading with them to keep looking. They wouldn't. "Your father made his choice, Helena," one officer had told her, his voice laced with false sympathy. "Sometimes people aren't who we think they are." She wanted to scream at him, wanted to shove the truth down his throat until he had no choice but to listen. But it wouldn't have mattered. The truth didn't matter to them. The lie was easier. So they let it stand. And just like that, she was alone. Her mother had been gone for years, leaving her father as the only constant in her life. Now he was gone too. And all she had left was her little brother, Noah. He was only 7, too young to understand the full weight of what had happened, but old enough to feel it, old enough to know that things were different, that people whispered when they walked by, that no one wanted to sit next to them at school, that the house that had once been full of warmth now felt like a tomb. He still asked when their father was coming home. Helena didn't know how to answer him. She wanted to tell him soon, that their father was out there somewhere, fighting to get back to them, that everything would go back to normal. But the truth sat like a stone in her chest. She didn't know if he was alive, didn't know if she would ever see him again. All she knew was that she couldn't afford to break, not when Noah needed her, not when everyone else had already given up. She had tried to keep going, tried to push through the suffocating weight of loneliness, of grief, of anger so sharp it felt like it would tear her apart. But the world wouldn't let her forget. At school, the whispers had turned into open hostility. A boy in her class had laughed in her face one day and said, "Guess running away runs in the family." She had punched him so hard she broke his nose. She got suspended for it. The boy got a lecture about being more sensitive. That was when she realized they would never be on her side. No one would. If she wanted justice, she would have to find it herself. Because if the world thought she was going to just let them erase her father like he had never existed, they were dead wrong. But Helena refused to let the world bury her father in lies. If the police wouldn't search for the truth, she would. If no one else cared about what really happened, she would find the answers herself. And that search led her back to the one place she had been avoiding, his study. The house was silent, the kind of silence that seeped into the walls, heavy and unrelenting. Dust floated in the dim afternoon light as Helena moved through her father's study, her fingers trailing across the desk where he had once spent countless nights poring over case files. The air still carried the faintest trace of his aftershave, a cruel reminder that he had been here, that he should still be here. She didn't know what she was looking for. Maybe some clue he had left behind. Something, anything to prove that the story they had spun about him was a lie, that he hadn't abandoned them, that he hadn't run. The room had been searched before. The police had torn through it, leaving books and papers scattered in their wake. But they had been looking for confirmation, not answers. They wanted to close the case, not solve it. Helena had spent weeks avoiding this room, unwilling to face the emptiness her father had left behind. But now, standing in the middle of it, she refused to leave with nothing. Her fingers brushed against the floor, where the wooden boards met at an uneven angle, a detail she had never noticed before. She hesitated, then pressed down. The board shifted beneath her touch. Her pulse spiked. Slowly, carefully, she pried it open. Beneath the floor, wedged tightly in the dark space, was a folder, thin but worn, hidden. Helena's hands shook as she pulled it out. She flipped it open, expecting, what? Letters? Old case files? Anything but what she actually found. Inside were dozens of notes, newspaper clippings, and official reports, meticulously compiled. Some pages were scrawled with her father's handwriting, underlined, circled, marked in frantic red ink. Her breath caught as her eyes darted across the words, trying to make sense of what she was looking at. And then she saw it. One name, repeated, burned into the pages. Victor Calloway. The name Victor Calloway burned in Helena's mind like a brand, an undeniable truth that refused to be ignored. The papers in her trembling hands painted a picture far darker than she had imagined. Calloway was not the untouchable beacon of justice the world believed him to be. He was something far worse, a man who had twisted the very foundation of the legal system into a tool of control, a weapon wielded against those who stood in his way. The cases laid out before her told a story no courtroom transcript ever would. People who had dared to challenge Calloway, to expose the corruption festering beneath his carefully crafted image, had disappeared. Not overnight, not in ways that raised immediate suspicion, but they had been erased, slowly, methodically. Some were branded criminals, their reputations destroyed by planted evidence, false accusations, in trials where the verdict had been decided long before they even stepped into the courtroom. Others simply vanished, lost to the shadows, their names whispered only in fleeting moments before being forgotten entirely. Her father had been one of them. Helena's pulse pounded as she traced the notes in his handwriting, each line a desperate attempt to piece together something too big, too monstrous to comprehend. Her father had been on the verge of exposing Calloway. He had seen the pattern, the connections, the disappearances. He must have known what it meant, that he was putting a target on his own back. And yet he hadn't stopped. He had fought until the moment he was silenced. The weight of it was suffocating. How many lives had been shattered because of this man? How many families torn apart? And yet Calloway still sat on his high-backed chair, delivering verdicts with the cold certainty of a man who had never known consequences. The world still saw him as a hero. The deeper Helena dug, the clearer the danger became. She had uncovered something she was never meant to see. Secrets buried beneath layers of power and deception. But the moment she thought she was getting closer to the truth, she realized she wasn't the only one watching. The house was supposed to be empty. Helena knew every creaking floorboard, every subtle shift of air, every sound that the old walls made when settling into the silence of the night. But as she stepped into the dimly lit hallway, something felt wrong. It wasn't just the lingering unease from reading her father's notes, from discovering that Victor Calloway wasn't just a judge, but an executioner, or from realizing that her father's disappearance had been orchestrated, not accidental. No, this was different. This was immediate. This was present. She hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. The front door was still locked. The windows remained shut, their curtains drawn tight. But something was off. The air felt disturbed, like someone had been here, like someone had stood in this very space just moments before she entered. Her eyes swept over the living room. Nothing out of place. The coffee table was exactly how she had left it. The blanket on the couch still folded, her father's old police mug resting where it always did. But then she saw the door, her bedroom door. It was open. She knew for a fact she had closed it before going downstairs. A slow, icy wave of dread crawled up her spine, the kind that made her feel like the walls had eyes, like the darkness itself was breathing. Her fingers curled into fists, her heartbeat hammering in her ears as she forced herself forward, step by step, toward the open door. The hallway stretched endlessly, the shadows pressing in on her, the silence turning unbearable. Her fingertips brushed against the wooden frame as she reached for the switch, but then she saw it. A single piece of white paper taped to the mirror. The words were scrawled in thick, bold strokes, sharp and deliberate. "Stop digging!" Helena's breath hitched. The paper wasn't there before. She felt her chest tighten, her stomach twist into a knot so tight she thought she might choke on the fear crawling up her throat. Someone had been in her house. Not hours ago, not sometime in the past week. Recently, maybe minutes ago. Maybe while she was downstairs. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, peeling the note from the glass. The ink was still fresh, smudging slightly beneath her touch. Her lungs burned as she forced herself to breathe. This was a warning, a direct message. Someone knew she was getting too close. Someone was watching her, her father's study, the hidden files, the name Victor Calloway scrawled in frantic red ink. Someone had been waiting for her to find them, and now they wanted her to stop. She clenched her jaw, forcing down the panic threatening to consume her. Fear was what they wanted. Whoever had left this note, whoever had stepped into her home without a single trace, without making a sound, they wanted her scared, but she wasn't going to stop. Helena knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed someone who understood what her father had been up against, someone who had been in the fight before. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few tired patrons nursing their coffee under the dim, flickering neon lights. The scent of burnt toast and stale grease lingered in the air, mixing with the low hum of a jukebox playing a tune no one was really listening to. Helena pushed open the glass door, the bell above it jingling softly as she stepped inside. Her heart pounded, her breath steady but controlled. This was the only lead she had left. She spotted him immediately. Daniel Reeves. He sat in the farthest booth, back against the wall, his broad shoulders hunched slightly under a worn leather jacket. He stirred his coffee absently, gaze fixed on the tabletop, but Helena knew better than to think he wasn't aware of everything happening around him. Former FBI, former ally of her father, and as far as she knew, the last person who might still give a damn about the truth. Helena walked toward him, her boots scuffing against the tiled floor. She didn't wait for an invitation. She slid into the seat across from him and leveled her gaze at him. Reeves barely glanced up. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was rough, edged with exhaustion and something colder. Something broken. "I didn't come for your permission." That made him look at her. His eyes, deep-set and sharp despite the years that had worn him down, studied her for a long moment, measuring, calculating. Then he sighed, setting his spoon down with a quiet clink. "Go home, kid." Helena clenched her fists under the table. She had expected resistance, but she didn't have time for this. "They came into my house." She kept her voice even, but the fury behind it was unmistakable. "They left a message. Stop digging." Reeves didn't flinch, but something in his expression hardened. "That's supposed to mean something to me." "You worked with my father," she said, her voice sharp. "You knew what kind of man he was." Reeves exhaled through his nose, a dry, humorless sound. "I knew Ethan Carter. Thought I did anyway. But he's gone, and you're looking for answers that don't exist." Helena slammed a folder onto the table. The sound cut through the quiet murmur of the diner, turning a few heads before people quickly looked away. Reeves didn't touch it. Helena leaned in, her voice low, steady, unrelenting. "He was investigating Judge Calloway," she said. "He had proof of corruption, evidence that Calloway was silencing people who got in his way. And then he disappeared." Reeves said nothing. Helena opened the folder, flipping through pages, notes written in her father's familiar handwriting. Calloway's name circled, underlined, and another scrawled like a final warning. Alexander Blackwood. She watched Reeves carefully, his jaw tightened, barely perceptible, but she saw it. "You know that name," she pressed. Reeves leaned back, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, "Whatever your father was chasing," he said finally, voice quieter, grimmer. "It wasn't just Calloway." Helena's breath caught. What do you know? Reeves exhaled slowly. I know that Blackwood isn't just a name. He's a ghost. The kind that doesn't leave fingerprints, doesn't have a paper trail. The kind of man who doesn't exist, except when he wants to. Helena felt the weight of his words settle over her, but she refused to let it shake her. My father found something, she insisted, and it got him killed. Reeves met her gaze then, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Regret, guilt, or something worse, acceptance. He's dead, kid. His tone was flat, cold, like a fact he had accepted long ago. And if you keep digging, you're going to end up just like him. Helena's hands curled into fists. You don't know that. Reeves let out a tired chuckle, shaking his head. I know exactly how this works. He gestured to the folder. This isn't just a list of bad men doing bad things. This is a kill list. Your father ended up on it, and if you keep pushing, you will too. Helena's pulse pounded, but she didn't back down. My father didn't run, she said. He didn't disappear because he was scared. He fought, and I'm going to finish what he started. Reeves studied her for a long moment, the silence between them stretching thin, sharp as a blade. Then he leaned forward, his voice a whisper. Why do you care so much? Helena's throat tightened. Because he was my father. Because the world turned its back on him. Because no one else will fight for the truth. Because if she stopped now, she'd be proving them right. She didn't say any of that. Instead, she met Reeves's gaze and said, because someone has to. Helena knew that exposing the truth wasn't enough. People like Calloway didn't fall because of whispers or suspicions. They needed proof, undeniable, inescapable, broadcasted for the world to see. Helena knew that Calloway would never openly admit his crimes in public. Men like him didn't fear accusations. They feared evidence. And if she wanted to take him down, she needed proof, something undeniable, inescapable, broadcasted for the world to see. She spent weeks tracking his movements, following every lead, mapping out his routines. Then she found it, the perfect moment. The night before his trial, Calloway had arranged a private meeting at an upscale law firm, a closed-door conversation with his most trusted allies, fellow judges, prosecutors, men who had built their careers under his protection. Getting inside wasn't easy, but Helena had learned to move unseen. A law clerk's discarded notebook, a meeting room left unlocked for just a few minutes, enough time to plant a small recording device beneath a long mahogany table, hidden, out of sight. And then she waited. Calloway, arrogant as ever, had spoken freely, his voice dripping with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Justice doesn't exist, not the way people think it does. The system belongs to those who know how to use it. That's why your father disappeared. That's why I will never see the inside of a cell. Helena had everything she needed. Now all she had to do was press play. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension, the kind that coiled like a storm waiting to break. The air felt thick, charged, every seat filled with reporters, attorneys, and officers who had seen 1,000 trials but never one like this. Victor Calloway sat at the bench, untouchable as ever. His presence alone commanded the room, his expression calm, unreadable, his fingers tapping idly against the wooden desk as if the outcome had already been decided. Because in his mind, it had. Helena knew better. She sat in the gallery, hood pulled low, her grip tight around her phone. The world was watching, even if they didn't know it yet. The live stream was already running, silent for now, waiting. She had timed everything down to the second. The trial had barely begun when she made her move. She slipped her hand into her pocket, pressed play. And then his voice filled the room. You really think any of this matters? You think anyone is coming to stop me? The reaction was instant. Heads turned. The prosecution froze mid-sentence. The jury shifted, eyes darting across the room in confusion. The courtroom fell into stunned silence, broken only by the echo of Calloway's own words. Justice doesn't exist, not the way people think it does. The system belongs to those who know how to use it. That's why your father disappeared. That's why I will never see the inside of a cell. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Reporters scrambled for their cameras, fingers flying over keyboards. The judge who had ruled without question, the man who had shaped the law to fit his will, had just condemned himself. And Calloway knew it. His face went pale, the first crack in his carefully maintained composure. He stood sharply, his chair scraping against the floor, his hands slamming against the desk. "Turn that off!" His voice rang out, sharp, desperate. But it was too late. The live stream was still running. Not just in the courtroom, but to millions. The counter on Helena's phone had skyrocketed. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then over 1 million. The world was watching. Outside, crowds had already gathered. Screens in newsrooms flickered with his confession. It was spreading faster than he could control. The courtroom doors burst open. Federal agents, dark suits, crisp movements, their presence unmistakable. They didn't hesitate. "Victor Calloway," the lead agent announced, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and collusion in multiple criminal enterprises." For the first time in his life, Calloway had no control. "No," he snarled, his face twisting in fury. "You can't do this." But the cuffs snapped around his wrists. Helena exhaled, watching as they dragged him from his throne. And outside, the world burned with the truth. The fight for justice is just beginning. More shocking twists are ahead. Don't miss a moment. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay with us. Thank you for standing for truth and justice. Where are you watching from? Let us know. The city was alive with neon and shadows, streets slick with rain, reflecting the harsh glow of streetlights. It should have been quiet at this hour, but quiet was a luxury Helena no longer had. The moment she and Reeves had left the courthouse, the hunt had begun. At first it was just a feeling, a presence. A car that took the same turns as them, headlights too steady, too intentional. Reeves had noticed it too. He didn't say anything at first, just tightened his grip on the wheel, his jaw locking as he flicked a glance at the rearview mirror. Then the second car appeared, and the third. Helena's stomach twisted. "They're boxing us in." "Yeah," Reeves muttered. His voice was calm, but the kind of calm that came before a storm. The kind of calm that knew what was coming next. A moment later, the lead car's headlights flared. Then, movement. The SUV behind them suddenly surged forward, ramming into their bumper. The impact sent them lurching forward, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. Helena's hands flew to the dashboard, heart hammering. "Son of a—" Reeves snarled, yanking the wheel, forcing the car to steady. Another hit, harder this time. Helena whipped around, catching a glimpse of the driver behind them, a faceless silhouette, eyes hidden behind tinted glass. No hesitation, no humanity. Just a job to finish. Reeves gritted his teeth. "Hold on!" And then, he hit the gas. The engine roared as they shot forward, weaving through the traffic, dodging between late-night taxis and oblivious drivers. The SUVs followed without hesitation, matching them move for move. A red light loomed ahead. "Reeves! Not stopping!" The car barreled through the intersection, horns blaring, brakes shrieking as cars swerved out of the way. One of the SUVs wasn't so lucky. A semi-truck slammed into its side with a sickening crunch, metal folding like paper. But the others kept coming. Helena's pulse pounded. "They're not letting us go." "They don't have to," Reeves growled. "They just have to keep us moving until we have nowhere left to run." Another turn, sharp, violent, barely controlled. They shot down a narrow side street, the walls of old brick buildings blurring past. The SUVs followed. "They're too fast," Helena hissed. "Then we make them slow down." Reeves yanked the wheel again, sending them flying onto an abandoned stretch of industrial road. Warehouses loomed on either side, their broken windows like watching eyes. The SUVs spread out, one flanking them on the right, the other closing in from behind. And then, gunfire. Helena ducked as bullets tore through the back windshield, glass exploding around them. Reeves cursed. "They're getting desperate." Another shot, the side mirror shattered. Helena's breathing came fast, sharp, but she forced herself to think. There had to be a way out. Then she saw it. A construction site ahead, open scaffolding, stacks of steel beams, a half-built overpass. "Take the left ramp," she said. Reeves didn't question it. He just gunned the engine. The car shot forward, tires screeching as they veered up the makeshift ramp. The SUVs followed. Too fast. Too aggressive. Just as the first one hit the incline, Reeves braked hard. The sudden stop sent them skidding, but the SUV behind them wasn't so lucky. It couldn't slow down in time. Helena watched as it sailed off the edge, a heartbeat of weightlessness before it plunged down, slamming into the steel beams below. The explosion lit up the night. One down, but the second SUV was still coming. Reeves didn't hesitate. He threw the car back into motion, barreling through the construction site, weaving between obstacles. The SUV followed, relentless. Helena's mind raced. They needed an edge. Then she spotted it, a stack of concrete barriers, barely stable, teetering on the edge of collapse. She turned to Reeves. "Get us close." His eyes flicked to the same spot. Understanding. Without a word, he adjusted course. The SUV behind them didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. As soon as they passed the stack, Helena slammed her foot against the base of the nearest barrier. The force was enough. The entire stack collapsed in a crashing wave of debris, just as the SUV drove straight into it. A second impact, a second explosion of metal and dust. Then, silence. Only the hum of the engine, the distant wail of sirens. The tires screamed against the pavement as Reeves wrenched the wheel, the car jerking violently to the left. Too late. Helena's stomach lurched as the black SUVs cut across the intersection ahead, blocking the road like an iron gate. A trap. The headlights bore down on them, blinding, their engines growling like predators circling wounded prey. Reeves slammed the brakes. The car skidded to a halt just inches from the blockade. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, movement. The SUV doors swung open in perfect synchronization. Black suits, black boots, guns. Helena's pulse pounded. This wasn't the police. This wasn't a warning. This was an execution. Reeves exhaled slowly, knuckles white around the steering wheel. "Stay low." Helena didn't need to be told twice. She ducked just as the first gunshot shattered the windshield. Glass exploded in every direction. Reeves cursed, throwing the car into reverse. But the moment they started moving, another SUV slid in behind them. Trapped. Another shot, this time tearing through the passenger side mirror. Helena's breath came fast, sharp, adrenaline flooding her veins. There was no time to think, only to act. Reeves reached for his gun. Helena grabbed the laptop. If they took them alive, it was over. Then, a voice. Smooth, controlled, dangerous. "Get out of the car." Helena didn't recognize it, but Reeves did. His jaw clenched. His grip on the gun tightened. "Blackwood," he muttered. The name sent a chill down Helena's spine. Blackwood was here. The man who had erased her father. The man who owned men like Calloway. The man who had sent those SUVs after them, like hounds on a hunt. Reeves met her eyes. A silent conversation. This was bad. Helena swallowed hard. They had one chance. Then the voice came again. "Last warning." More footsteps, more shadows closing in. Helena gritted her teeth. She wasn't dying here. Not like this. The night was suffocatingly still. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the quiet clicks of guns being readied. Helena and Reeves were trapped. The SUVs blocked every escape route, their black frames blending into the darkness, forming an unbreakable wall of steel and power. Armed men surrounded them, their faces unreadable behind the dim glow of the streetlights. And then, he stepped forward. Alexander Blackwood. Tall, impeccably dressed, composed in a way that made it clear. This wasn't a man who ever lost. His presence alone sent a chill through Helena's veins. This was the man who had erased her father, the man who owned men like Calloway, the man who had spent years turning the justice system into his personal chessboard. And tonight, he was here for her. Blackwood exhaled softly, as if mildly amused by the entire situation. His sharp blue eyes studied her for a moment before shifting to Reeves. Then, he pulled out a gun. In one fluid motion, he raised it and pressed the barrel against Reeves' temple. Helena's breath hitched. Reeves didn't flinch. Let's not waste time, Blackwood said, his voice smooth, unhurried. Give me everything you have, the files, the recordings, all of it. Or, he pressed the gun harder against Reeves's skull. You watch him die. Silence. Helena's fingers curled into fists, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She had known this moment would come. Blackwood was too powerful, too meticulous to let things slip through his fingers. But knowing it and facing it were two different things. Reeves, still unmoving, let out a dry chuckle. You think threatening me changes anything? Blackwood arched a brow, his lips curving into something dangerously close to a smirk. It's not you I expect to break. His gaze slid back to Helena. You, however, he studied her, his head tilting slightly. You're different. You're not like your father. Helena's stomach twisted. You still believe in justice? Blackwood continued, his tone almost conversational. You still think the truth wins in the end. But let me tell you something, Miss Carter. His expression darkened, his voice dropping just enough to send ice through her veins. Truth doesn't matter. Power does. Her hands trembled, not with fear, with fury. You killed my father, she said, her voice low but steady. Blackwood didn't blink. Your father dug too deep. He forgot his place, and now, so have you. He cocked the gun. Last chance, give me the files. Helena forced herself to breathe, to think. There had to be a way out, but time was running out. Reeves met her eyes, a silent message. Don't give in. Helena clenched her jaw. Then, she made her move. The pressure of the gun against Reeves's temple hadn't wavered, his finger resting just lightly enough on the trigger to make it clear. He was in control. The night, the city, the entire system bent to his will, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do about it. Give me the files, he repeated, his voice perfectly calm. Helena didn't blink. Instead, she smiled. It wasn't the reaction Blackwood expected. Slowly, deliberately, she tilted her head, her expression unreadable. You should check your phone. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. Then, his phone buzzed. Once, twice, then again, and again, and again. Notifications flooding in, vibrating against the silence like an alarm growing louder with every second. Blackwood frowned. With one hand, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone, his grip still firm on the gun pressed against Reeves. He glanced at the screen. Blackwood's hand tensed around the gun, his finger hovering over the trigger. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. The glow from his phone screen illuminated his face, casting harsh shadows over his sharp features. His own words, his own confession, were playing back at him. Helena watched as his eyes flicked across the screen, absorbing the impossible reality. The live stream was still running. Millions were watching. Millions of people had just heard him admit the truth. Justice doesn't exist. The system belongs to those who know how to use it. That's why your father disappeared. That's why I will never see the inside of a cell. The words echoed in the cold night air, twisting around him like chains tightening with every second. Blackwood's entire demeanor shifted. The confidence, the indifference. It all drained from his face, replaced by something Helena had never expected to see in him. Uncertainty. His men, the shadows in black suits who had flanked him with unwavering loyalty, were shifting now, stealing glances at their own phones. The ones who had come here to kill, to make sure Helena and Reeves never walked away from this. They had just realized the world was watching them too. Helena stood still, barely daring to breathe. She knew what this moment meant. Blackwood wasn't the kind of man who panicked. He didn't make mistakes. But this was something he had never planned for. The system he had built, the empire he controlled, was built on silence, on fear, on people too afraid to speak out, too powerless to fight back. But now his crimes were no longer whispers in the dark. They were exposed, broadcasted, unstoppable. The gun in his hand remained steady, still pressed against Reeves's skull. But Helena saw the flicker of hesitation, the way his grip had shifted ever so slightly. He was losing control, and he knew it. For a moment, no one moved. Then, his phone vibrated again. More notifications, Hundreds of thousands of comments flooding in, moving too fast to read. His name, Alexander Blackwood, was already trending. And just behind it, number Justice for Ethan Carter. Helena almost smiled. Blackwood's breathing had slowed, his mind racing behind those piercing eyes. He was calculating, trying to find a way out, trying to find a way to twist this in his favor. But there was none. Not this time. "Looks like the world's finally paying attention," Helena said, her voice calm, steady. She took a single step forward, holding his gaze. She wasn't afraid anymore. Blackwood slowly lifted his gaze from the phone, his expression unreadable. But something cold, something dark, flickered behind his eyes. "This changes nothing," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled. But there was an edge to it now, a crack in the armor. "Oh, I think it changes everything," Helena shot back. For the first time, Blackwood was cornered. For the first time, the world saw him for what he truly was. And for the first time, he couldn't silence the truth. The distant wail of sirens cut through the night like a warning, sharp and unrelenting. The sound grew louder with each passing second, a relentless drumbeat of justice closing in. For the first time, Blackwood wasn't the one pulling the strings. Helena could see it in his eyes, the cold, calculating stare of a man who had never lost, never been outplayed, until now. His mind was racing, calculating, searching for an exit that no longer existed. But there was no way out. Not this time. The glow of his phone screen still reflected on his face, the never-ending flood of comments, headlines, and messages moving too fast to track. His name, Alexander Blackwood, was no longer a symbol of power. It was a brand of corruption, a target, and now the world wanted him to answer for it. Then, lights. Red and blue flooded the streets, bouncing off the dark walls of the city, flashing across the faces of the men who had once stood behind Blackwood without question. Now they hesitated. The black SUVs that had blocked every exit, the armed men who had been prepared to kill without a moment's thought, all of them were now caught in the open, their backs exposed, their escape routes severed. FBI vehicles screeched to a halt, doors slamming open as agents flooded the scene. Their weapons were drawn, their voices sharp, cutting through the air like gunfire. "Hands where we can see them!" Helena didn't move, her breath held tight in her chest as she watched the moment unfold. Blackwood remained still, but the crack in his composure had widened. His fingers twitched slightly against the grip of his gun, still pressed against Reeves' skull. A final attempt at control, a final, desperate move from a man who had never been on the losing side before. Helena didn't blink. "You're done." Her voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut through the chaos. Blackwood turned his gaze toward her, and for the first time, she saw something she never thought she'd see in him. Not anger, not arrogance. Fear. Because he knew this was the end. The agents advanced quickly, their movements swift, precise, unstoppable. "Drop the weapon," one of them ordered, his gun trained directly on Blackwood's chest. For a moment, Helena thought he might fight it, that he might make one last desperate move, take Reeves with him, refused to go down without dragging someone else into the abyss. But he didn't. Instead, his fingers uncurled. The gun slipped from his grip, clattering against the pavement, the sound deafening in the heavy silence that followed. "On the ground," the agent barked. Blackwood didn't move at first. Then slowly, with the weight of the entire world watching, he obeyed. He lowered himself to his knees, his hands raised, his jaw locked tight. And then, the cuffs. The moment the steel snapped around his wrists, the empire he had built crumbled. Helena exhaled, her chest burning from the weight of everything leading to this moment. It was over. The flash of cameras erupted like a lightning storm, reporters pressing against barricades, their voices a chaotic blur of questions, accusations, demands. But there was only one thing that mattered now. Blackwood was finished, and for the first time in her life, Helena Carter had won. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Helena stood on the porch of her small apartment building, the night air cool against her skin, even though her body burned with the heat of everything that had happened. She had watched Alexander Blackwood, the man who had destroyed her father's life, dragged away in handcuffs under the relentless flash of cameras, and she had felt a fierce, brutal satisfaction until the emptiness returned. Justice had come for Blackwood, but justice had not brought her father back. The streets beyond her door were silent, except for distant sirens and the low hum of city life, as if the world had moved on while she remained frozen in the moment that changed everything. Weeks passed and the public celebrated the fall of Blackwood's empire as if it were the final chapter of a story. Headlines proclaimed victory, commentators praised law enforcement, and social media exploded with hashtags of triumph. But Helena knew the truth behind the headlines. Her father was still missing, his body never recovered, his fate unresolved. No obituary, no memorial service, only silence. The same system that had torn her father from her life had delivered retribution, but it had not repaired the injustice done to him or to her family. Every morning she woke to the hollow ache of absence. Every evening she returned home to an apartment that felt too large and too empty. Her little brother Noah had been placed in foster care until Helena could prove stability. She visited him on weekends, watching his wide eyes follow her through the visitor room glass, his small hands pressed to the window as though trying to hold on to something he could not grasp. He asked about their father every visit, and she forced herself to speak words she did not fully believe. "He's coming home soon." Then one morning something changed. She arrived at the door to find a single envelope slipped under the threshold. No stamp, no return address, only her name written in jagged, familiar handwriting. The paper felt thick and slightly textured beneath her fingertips, the handwriting abrupt and urgent. 2 words scrawled in black ink that sent her heart into her throat. "Continue." She backed away, clutching the envelope, her breath shallow and rapid, mind racing with the implications. The handwriting. It was exactly like the note he had written to her years ago. The note she had memorized during sleepless nights of fear and hope. Her fingers trembled as she tore the envelope open. Inside was a single sheet of heavy white paper, blank except for those 2 words. No explanation, no signature, no clues about its origin. Yet in that moment, Helena knew the truth with a certainty that eclipsed all doubt. Her father was alive. He had sent her this message. He was reaching out from somewhere beyond her reach. The injustice she had suffered, having her father taken away, her name dragged through mud, her life torn apart, had been replaced by a new mission. She sank onto the couch, envelope in hand, and allowed herself a single tear. It was a tear for the father who had vanished, for the justice delayed, for the innocence stolen. But it was also a tear for the promise now reignited within her, a promise to continue, to fight, to uncover the truth no matter how deep it was buried. She would not allow her father's legacy to be swallowed by silence. She would not let his voice be forgotten. Helena spent the next hours pacing the small living room, the envelope's crisp edges cutting into her palms like shards of truth. She replayed every moment since her father's disappearance, each injustice stacked one upon the other like stones in a monument to cruelty. The system had spat him out, labeled him a traitor, then swallowed him whole without remorse. It had left her mother dead, her brother alone, and her own life shattered. But now she held proof that he was not gone, that he was still alive somewhere, watching and waiting for her to understand. She opened her laptop and pulled up her father's last encrypted files, scanning them with renewed intensity. Names jumped out at her, contacts he had met, locations he had visited, cryptic annotations in the margins of legal briefs. She copied every file to a secure drive and encrypted it again, tucking the drive into her jacket pocket as if it were armor. Her phone buzzed. A text from Reeves. "Have you seen it? Call me." She pressed the call button. "Reeves," she said, voice raw but determined. "I saw the letter. I thought I'd be happy for you, but this changes everything." "It has to," Helena replied. "He's alive, Reeves. He's alive and he wants me to keep going." "Meet me tomorrow at dawn. We'll go over everything," he said, and she hung up. Morning came too quickly. She dressed in dark layers, checked her pockets, and left her apartment quietly. Reeves was waiting in a nondescript rental car, engine idling. He handed her a thermos of coffee and said, "Your father's last known location was the archives building downtown. I dug up security logs. He entered 3 days before he vanished, but never exited." Helena nodded. "Let's go." The archives building loomed ahead, its brick facade scarred by time. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of light. Helena climbed a staircase to the top floor, where she found a leather-bound journal wedged between ledgers. Her father's handwriting filled the pages, notes on Blackwood's network, references to a safe house, coordinates scrawled in urgent ink. The final entry read, "If you find this, know that I'm still alive. I'm fighting to stay free. Trust no one. Continue." Tears blurred her vision. She clutched the journal as Reeves found her. "He's alive," she whispered. Reeves placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Then we follow his path. Together." They rented a secure apartment and assembled a small team of trusted allies. Whiteboards filled with connections and timelines tracked Blackwood's empire. Helena pored over her father's journal nightly, each revelation fueling her resolve. She visited Noah on weekends, assuring him their father would return. One stormy evening, Reeves looked up and said, "We're ready. We have enough evidence to dismantle the network. Where do we start?" Helena stood holding the journal like a sacred text. "We start with him and finish what he began." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating her determined silhouette. The fight was far from over, but Helena Carter would not be silenced. Helena stepped out onto her rooftop balcony as the city settled into uneasy slumber. The night sky stretched above her like a vast, indifferent witness. Below, distant sirens wailed, punctuating the hush with reminders that life went on in the streets, even though the fight she had waged for so long had only just begun. Blackwood was behind bars, a spectacle for cameras and headlines, but Helena knew the victory was superficial. The arrest of one man did not uproot decades of rot baked into the very foundations of power. Judges who had rubber-stamped his lies still wore their robes. Prosecutors who had looked the other way still walked free. Politicians and corporate executives who profited from his corruption remained untouched, their hands cleansed by wealth and influence. The system that had swallowed her father whole remained intact, ready to swallow anyone else who dared speak the truth. Above her, the sky was a bruised tapestry of midnight blue and smoky clouds lit by the glow of distant streetlights. Stars peeked through in scattered pinpricks of cold fire, uncaring and eternal. Helena drew a slow breath, the night air sharp and damp against her lungs. She thought of her father, his voice echoing in her memory, telling her that justice was not a gift handed down from the powerful, but a burden carried by those brave enough to shoulder it. She thought of the countless, faceless victims whose lives had been shattered by a system built to protect the few at the expense of the many. She thought of Noah waiting in a foster home, deserving of a father she had yet to find. Her hands tightened around the railing as rage and grief coiled within her like a living thing. Blackwood's downfall was a spark, but the inferno of change had not yet ignited. There were still hidden cells of influence ready to snuff out anyone foolish enough to challenge them. There were still judges on the bench taking bribes, law enforcement officers accepting payoffs, elected officials swapping favors in backroom deals. The network was sprawling, decentralized, woven so deeply into the city's fabric that pulling one thread risked unraveling lives, including her own. Helena closed her eyes and let herself feel the weight of it all. She had fought to expose Blackwood's crimes and had won that battle. But the war raged on. Tomorrow she would gather Reeves and the few allies she could trust to pore over her father's journal and Blackwood's hidden files, identifying targets and mapping connections. They would leak evidence to the press, stage public hearings, bring lawsuits and testify under oath. They would refuse to back down in the face of threats. They would refuse to be silenced by violence or intimidation. She opened her eyes to the horizon, where the first blush of dawn threatened the darkness. She whispered to the indifferent stars, to the city that had taken everything from her, to the father she still believed was alive somewhere out there. "I will not stop." The words were a vow etched in steel, a promise that echoed off the surrounding buildings and ricocheted into the night. She was alone on the rooftop, but not powerless. Blackwood's empire might have reached deep, but truth was a force he had underestimated, and Helena Carter embodied that truth. The injustice she had endured fueled her, sharpened her purpose, and steeled her resolve. The system was broken, but it could be broken open, and she would be the one to pry it apart, piece by piece, until no corner of corruption remained unexposed. With one final glance at the sky, at the indifferent stars that would watch her fight unfold, Helena turned from the railing. Her path was clear, her mission unyielding. The night surrendered to dawn, but the battle for justice blazed on, and she would walk into it unafraid. And as the flashbulbs of the media faded behind her, Helena turned her gaze toward the vast night sky, where the real battle was only just beginning. Helena Carter stood on the rooftop as the city below slumbered under a blanket of fog and sodium streetlights, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face like a warning. The world had celebrated Alexander Blackwood's arrest as though it were the final act of justice, a tidy conclusion to a sordid tale of corruption, but Helena knew that celebration was premature. Blackwood had been only the apex predator of a much larger, far more insidious ecosystem, one built on power, secrecy, and the ruthless exploitation of anyone who dared stand in its path. Beneath the veneer of order lay a network of compromised judges, bought prosecutors, and elected officials who answered not to the people they served, but to the wealth and influence that funded their careers. The system remained a tangled web of rot, and the man who had once controlled it from the shadows was now behind bars, only because his own arrogance had handed him to the world on a silver platter. But her father, Detective Ethan Carter, had never been about spectacle or headlines. He had been about truth, and that truth had not died when Blackwood had fallen. In fact, it had only grown louder. Helena's chest tightened as she thought of him, the man who had taught her that justice was not a reward for the powerful, but a duty owed to the powerless. He had vanished without a trace, his name defamed, his life reduced to rumors of betrayal and desertion. No body had been recovered. No grave had marked his absence. Instead, he remained an absence itself, an open wound in Helena's life that refused to heal. Tonight, standing above the sleeping city, she felt the full weight of that absence pressing down on her shoulders. Every victory she had achieved since his disappearance, the exposure of Calloway, the live stream that shattered Blackwood's invincibility, the collapse of his criminal empire, had felt hollow without his return. She had won battles, but the war was far from over. Her father was still out there somewhere, a ghost hunted by forces she was only beginning to understand, waiting for her to find him and bring him home. Her fingers curled around the worn leather cover of his journal, which lay open on the rooftop ledge beside her. The final entry had ended abruptly, scrawled coordinates pointing to a derelict warehouse on the edge of the city. Coordinates she had followed only to discover a hidden metal box containing the last shred of his voice. A note that read, "If you're reading this, I'm alive. Keep going." That simple message had ignited a fire in Helena that refused to be extinguished by fear or grief. She closed her eyes and inhaled the frigid air deep into her lungs, letting the chill fill her bloodstream and steel her resolve. Around her, the night seemed to pulse with quiet menace, as though the darkness itself were watching, waiting to pounce on any sign of weakness. Helena had learned to embrace that fear and channel it into something stronger: purpose. Tomorrow she would meet Reeves and their small band of allies to plan the next phase of their crusade. They would follow the breadcrumbs her father had left, unravel the threads of corruption that had ensnared so many innocents, and expose every person who had allowed Blackwood's influence to flourish. They would leverage leaked documents, coordinate with investigative journalists, and use the very same live stream tactics that had brought Blackwood to his knees. Each revelation would be a blow against the rotten core of the system, each public hearing a step toward dismantling the machinery of injustice. But beneath all of that lay her personal mission: to find Ethan Carter. He had vanished because he had gotten too close to the truth. He had disappeared because he had dared to confront a power that did not tolerate challengers. If he were still alive, he would be fighting with every breath, just as Helena fought now. The thought of him, battered but unbroken, surviving in the shadows somewhere beyond her reach, fueled her determination like gasoline on a fire. Helena opened her eyes and gazed upward at the night sky, its vast expanse dotted with distant, indifferent stars. They were the same stars her father had pointed out to her when she was a little girl learning to read constellations, guiding lights in the darkness, eternal witnesses to the struggles of those below. She could almost hear his voice, low and steady, reminding her that even the darkest night must eventually yield to dawn. Drawing in a final, shuddering breath, Helena let the wind carry away her doubts and fears. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, yet it echoed across the silent rooftop with the force of a battle cry. "I will not stop." She turned away from the edge and walked back into the warmth of her apartment, every step measured, every movement purposeful. The road ahead would be treacherous, strewn with threats and betrayals, but Helena Carter had tasted injustice and chosen to fight rather than flee. The city below might slumber, but she remained wide awake, driven by love, by loss, and by an unshakable conviction that no system, no matter how corrupted, was beyond reckoning. And somewhere out there, beyond the reach of streetlights and sirens, her father waited, alive, determined, and counting on her to bring him home. If this story made your heart race, if you felt the weight of injustice pressing down, if you found yourself holding your breath in anticipation, then don't let it end here. The fight for truth, for justice, for those who have been silenced is not just Helena Carter's battle, it is ours as well. Every story like this is a reminder that power, corruption, and injustice are not just fiction. They exist in the real world, shaping lives, taking futures, and deciding who gets to rise and who is forced to fall. But stories like this also remind us that courage exists, that resistance is possible, and that those who refuse to back down can change everything. By hitting the like button, you are showing your support for voices that demand the truth, for those who refuse to be silenced, for the fighters who push forward despite the odds stacked against them. And by subscribing, you ensure that you never miss another chapter in this ongoing battle, another tale of resilience, another moment where justice stands on the edge of a knife. This is not just entertainment. This is a movement, a call to never accept corruption as an immovable force, to never turn a blind eye to those who have lost everything in the pursuit of what is right. Every like, every comment, every subscription fuels the fire that stories like Helena's ignite. The more people who watch, the harder it is for injustice to hide. The more voices that rise, the stronger the truth becomes. So do not just watch. Do not just listen. Be part of the fight. Subscribe, stay, and prepare for what's coming next. Because this is far from over. The battle has only begun.